Hello there, and welcome along to episode 9 of season 3 of the Gardener Ben podcast, brought to you in association with Peterbilt's Roses, winner of 30 Chelsea Gold medals and creating timeless roses since 1968. Go online and shop at www.peterbiltsroses.com. Now, those of you listening at home won't actually notice this, but there's been a change to my published schedule. And before we get into today's all-important episode, I want to extend my personal thanks to Katrina at Building a Food Forest Scotland. Katrina was supposed to be joining me for a bit of a recap after she joined me for season 2, and I wanted to touch base with her to see how her growing season had been and how Clayton had been getting on in the garden. However, there is something really quite important going on just at the moment with regards to the horticultural industry, and I wanted to move episodes around to bring this to your attention. On today's episode of the podcast, I'm joined by Sally Nex, who is involved with the Peat-Free Partnership. You'll find the Peat-Free Partnership operating accounts on Instagram and on TikTok, raising awareness about the sheer amount of peat that the horticultural industry in the UK is still legally extracting from the ground and using within the products that we purchase. Sally brought some really interesting points to the table, that even if a consumer purchases peat-free compost and takes lots of measures to eradicate peat from their garden, there's still a lot of hidden peat in the products that we purchase. I was shocked to find that it was actually added to horse manure to make mushroom compost. I also completely forgot about the sheer tens of millions of potted herbs that are sold in supermarkets every single year, containing large amounts of peat, and of course the sale and purchase of houseplants. Many companies have made the move to peat-free compost, but many haven't, and peat is still being extracted from our environment in a vast quantity, causing massive environmental damage, releasing huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, and even being the cause of large amounts of flooding, as peat bogs quite naturally have the ability to hold huge amounts of water. The Peat-Free Partnership know that this is not something that can simply be changed overnight at the flick of a switch, but several governments, one after the other, have said that this is going to be brought to their attention and that they will legislate this particular part of the horticultural industry, safeguarding our peat bogs for future generations. It's time for this to stop, and for government to bring this very important matter of carbon and the destruction of the environment to the top of their agenda. If you're as shocked as I am that the extraction of peat is still legal and peat is being sold still throughout the UK, making up millions and millions and millions of tonnes being extracted from the environment, you can go online at the Peat-Free Partnership now and sign the petition to lobby government to make sure this ends. You can also write to your local MP bringing this matter to the forefront of their attention and make sure that in 2026 we manage to get legislation to change. This, as I said to Sally during our conversation, has been a topic that has been raging for the entirety of my horticultural career. And as I hang up my boots and my tools and move into other areas of the horticultural industry, I'm really shocked and appalled that we're still having this conversation. So please do make sure that you go over to the Peat-Free Partnership and follow the link to sign the petition now, and join them on Instagram and TikTok, sharing their stories and their posts to raise awareness about this really important matter. I really hope that you enjoy the informative and interesting conversation that I had with Sally that follows. Today on the Gardener Ben podcast, I'm joined by Sally from the Peat-Free Partnership. Sally, welcome along to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks very much. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm exceedingly well, thank you very much. Now, Sally, I've invited you along to the podcast today. We're going to be talking about the Peat-Free Partnership and what the Peat-Free Partnership does and how it's lobbying government to change legislation and stuff. But as a gardener, we were talking just before I started recording this conversation today for the podcast that I'm astonished that we're still, after all these decades, having this conversation about peat.
Oh, I know. I can't believe it myself, to be quite honest. I mean, I first started Pete started coming onto my radar when I was still a garden writer, and that was back in 2006, I think.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about it quite a lot then. And then I think in 2010 it was the voluntary target came into play. And after that, I started writing a lot of sort of gardening news for various magazines, like Gardener's World magazine and The Garden, the RHS journal.
Yes.
And so while I was, it seemed to me like every couple of months or so there'd be some story or another about peat use in horticulture, and there seemed to be this sort of inching towards it, but this real reluctance to give up peat, and that carried on year after year after year, and here we are, 2025. That's nearly 20 years later, and
Yeah.
we're still talking about it.
I mean,
Nothing's happened. It's
I'm,
just extraordinary.
I'm sort of chuckling and smiling to myself because it is really quite serious, isn't it? And I mean, you're saying
Well,
that it first fell onto your radar in 2006 when I was doing my horticultural qualifications. It was something that we were being taught about as
yeah.
students and something that was phasing in. I mean, my career is. I'm not saying it's at an end, but I've just hung up my tools physically, and this is what I do for a living now. So I'm not physically working as a landscape gardener anymore, but obviously what I do, I suppose, might have more impact in changing legislation and changing the way people think about it. But even way back in there, and we're talking about the year 2000, 2001.
Yeah,
We were
yeah.
looking at substitutes for peat and growing in different ways, and some of them were absolutely disastrous, but some of them were quite successful. So tell us a little bit about the Peat Free Partnership and what it is that the organisation actually does.
Sure. Well, we've been working for about a couple of years, really, just to get it done. To be honest, to get legislation through the parliaments in right the way across the UK. So England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. It's a devolved matter, but for very complicated trade reasons, it's very difficult for any one of those governments to just kind of stand up and say, right, enough, we want to do it. It's one of those issues that's proved very tricky, which is
Yeah.
partly why it hasn't happened, actually, to be honest. But it is so necessary, because without that legislation, we can't move forward. We're just in this limbo of forever talking about peat and whether or not we should be using it. And some people are still reducing the amount of peat they use. To be honest, the latest figures are showing that sort of quite encouraging progress that we made when the government actually said we're going to legislate by 2024. A lot of that progress is really starting to slow now, and actually it's pretty much stalled. And so that is an indication, really, that we just need legislation in order to be able to move on and get it done, and just get the peat out of gardening. It's like you said, it's something we've been talking about for such a long time, and there has been huge progress made. I mean, I'm not doing down what the horticultural industry has done to date. In fact, it's amazing. They've reduced the amount of peat that they use by over half, so that's an enormous amount. But we still use 760,000 cubic meters of peat in UK horticulture every single year. That's enough to fill over 300 Olympic-sized swimming pools. If you can envisage that amount of peat,
I was just,
it's
I just,
horrifying.
I'm just going to say. I mean, I'm astonished you've got that kind of information to hand, but I'm really glad that you do. I mean, that is, I mean, if you, it makes your mind boggle. I mean, that's
Mm.
just huge quantity, isn't it? Really, really is.
The scale is just phenomenal. And when you think that every cubic meter of peat that represents, it's been dug up out of a peat bog, that's released carbon, it's wrecking not only a uniquely biodiverse habitat, or a habitat that would be uniquely biodiverse if it wasn't being dug up, but also these are a key defence, for example, against flooding, and because peat bogs are so good at holding on to excess water when they're intact,
Hmm.
that they can actually protect local communities from flooding and excess rain. There are so many kind of natural ecosystem services that peat bogs provide when they're intact. The fact that we're draining them and digging them up is just a travesty. It's terrible.
It is. I mean, and as you say, I mean, it's astonishing that the horticultural industry has made as much progress as it has. I mean, you said we've managed to slash that by 50%, but as of yet, we're talking about an industry which is only given guidelines for reducing, not actually no, you cannot do and no, you should not be using. So this is all of very much at the moment is a suggestion and very much led by the consumer, I suppose, actually going, right, okay, we've now got more of an interest in buying a peat-free compost or buying a plant that's grown in or supplied in peat-free compost. So it's almost a little bit of an environment, sort of a financial sort of sort of tidbit, isn't it? Rather than actually, no, you shouldn't be doing this, and actually, this is what you should be doing.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the point about consumers is a really interesting one, because it's noticeable that where it's clearly labelled and it's clear what's peat-free and what isn't, and I'm talking here about bagged compost.
Yes.
Consumers are choosing peat-free bagged compost now as a matter of course. Didn't used to when I started gardening, and when I started gardening, the peat-free was tucked away around the back, and you had to rummage around to find it. These days, about 80 or 90% of the compost that's sold in the garden centre is peat-free. And the amount of, by volume, the amount of peat that's in retail peat, they call it, which is basically bagged peat. The amount of by volume in bagged compost is down to 16%. So that's a tiny, tiny amount. Now that's where the consumer can see, because it's got peat-free written in big friendly letters across the front.
Yes.
They're absolutely sure about what they're buying. Now plants, completely different. There is nothing on the label to say when a plant is peat free. There's nothing to say when it contains peat. And so there is no way that somebody going into a garden centre on a sort of, Saturday afternoon, having a nice afternoon out, they're not really going to want to think about all this stuff anyway and do all the research and, go into the finer points of horticultural sort of customs and things. But they go into these garden centres and they have absolutely no way of knowing what's in the pot. No way of knowing whether there's peat in the pot. And if they have the choice between a plant that's grown in peat-free and a plant that's grown in peat, I would imagine, given the behaviour on peat-free compost, that most people would choose a peat-free plant. But at the moment, they've got no way of telling. There's no way you can make informed decisions under those circumstances. And it's the same in supermarkets as well, because it's not just ornamental plants we're talking about here.
No, of course not. Yeah.
Most salad ingredients, most herbs, they're all grown in peat. All the mushrooms that you buy are grown in peat. There's lots and lots of what we refer to as hidden peat, but it's all we mean by that is peat that's not labelled.
Well, again, that's quite a strange thing, isn't it? Because if I cast my mind back, and it's not something you can buy anymore, which is quite frustrating as a gardener, but I thought that the mushrooms were grown in mushroom compost, which was I thought was horse manure or cow manure.
It is, but it's got what they call a casing layer of about 5 centimeters, I think it is, of peat on the top.
Okay,
And that's to help it.
That's something I didn't know.
Yeah, it's something that helps it to retain moisture.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not separated out, as it were, when they take the spent mushroom compost away. So when you buy mushroom compost, you are buying peat.
Okay, all right, in obviously but small but quite significant amounts. If you look at the
exactly,
sheer
the whole
volume
lot. It's not pure peat, obviously, but there is a peat element in it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. That's educated me, because I've become quite frustrated that I can't buy my mushroom. I mean, I was buying it in like loose by the cubic meter. I suppose is even worse, me admitting to that. But I didn't know there was peat in it. I used to use that on the garden quite a lot. I mean, I've got
This
at the
is the
moment.
thing. I mean, people who are really well disposed to all of this stuff, who are really open to the idea of being more environmentally friendly when they garden, are unable. They just don't know. It's a completely innocent mistake, that, and it's the kind of mistake that is just routine, because it's not clear what these things contain.
No, and again, I've actually made this. I mean, I use a huge amount of soil conditioner in the garden anyway, but I've actually decided to blend my own compost this year. So I've got two cubic meters of soil conditioner out on the drive, and I'm going to blend that with a little bit of chipped bark and a little bit of, well, not a little bit, but some loam-based compost to make my own, because I'm potting a very, very large quantity of roses this year.
I make quite a lot of my own compost, actually, and the reason I do that is not because peat-free bagged compost is no good, because there are lots of brands which are excellent, and I've used most of them now, actually, and have my favourites, obviously, like everybody does. But the fact is that the standard is very high. But the reason I make my own is because compost generally, peat-based or peat-free, is so expensive at the moment.
Yeah.
I can't afford it, to be quite honest. So yeah, it's a great idea to make as much of your own as you can.
I mean, I'm supposing that the cost of it is it's not so much the fact it is peat free, but it's just down to the sheer amount of money that we're paying for haulage and things, isn't it, at the
Yes,
moment? And
exactly.
fuel
It's
prices being so
transport and yeah,
being so high. So
that's
yeah,
right.
I intend to. I'm going to get the cement mixer out if I'm honest, because there's quite a large quantity to blend. So that's going to be something
Oh,
I'm going
good
to be
luck.
doing. If we might just back up the conversation just a little bit, we might have gone a little bit too quickly for some of the audience. Can we just talk about, you mentioned about where the peat is coming from? I know what it is, but could you explain to the listeners what it is and why its extraction is just so terrible for the environment? Because it is absolutely catastrophic, isn't it?
It is indeed. Well, the thing about peat bogs is that they are our most efficient carbon sinks by miles. So they only occupy, I think it's about 3% of the Earth's area. So it's a very small kind of amount of land, as it were, that's covered by peat bog.
Hmm.
But the thing about peat bogs is that they store carbon down to a great depth, and they're actually sort of, hectare for hectare, they store twice as much as the world's forests combined. So it's just phenomenal how much carbon they're able to just hang on to down
Hmm.
in the depths, and that's because of the way that they kind of rot things down. They're wetlands, so essentially what happens is that things fall into them, whether that's plants or animals or whatever, and so all of this dead material, which in a normal situation would just rot down like a compost rots down, because it rots down anaerobically underwater, it actually lays down that carbon, in a much more intensive sort of way. So and it's been doing it for years and years and years, which is why it develops these great depths. We're talking about, it does form very, very slowly. It's about a millimetre a year. So it'll take about 1,000 years for a metre deep of peat to form.
Wow.
And so you can be talking about, if you're mining peat down to, say, 3 meters deep, which is not unusual, you're talking about the peat that you're digging out at the bottom there is 3,000 years old. Just think about that. It's just remarkable. So, you can be buying a bag of compost down the garden centre and you don't think about it, do you? But actually, what you're looking there is archaeology. It's
Yes.
pure history.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It can be thousands of years old.
And again, if you
And
ask, if you, I mean, for instance, I've talked about this on my channels before, but the paving slabs, for instance, I've laid at home, I've talked about the fossils that are in those.
yes,
And
it's
I
amazing,
mean,
isn't it?
and you think, well, I'm the first person to touch that or see that or
Yeah,
creature to touch that in this many millions of years. But
yeah,
we've just sort of said, Pete, we're handling that, we're digging that up, and we're using that on a
absolutely.
very, very regular basis, and it's
Exactly.
3, 4 thousand years old.
That's right. And the problem is that as soon as you dig that up from right underneath the ground and you expose it to the air, of course, carbon plus oxygen equals carbon dioxide,
Hmm.
which is a greenhouse gas. So you are directly contributing to climate change. And what's more, in order to be able to dig it out, they have to drain it first.
Okay.
And draining peat also, it dries it out, it cracks, that exposes yet more peat, more carbon to the air. Um, and it just continues the damage, and that also ruins the ecosystem, its ability to absorb water, its ability to purify water as well, because that's another thing that peat bogs can do, is to improve the quality of our water. So many things that peat bogs could do for us, but all the time while we are draining them and sort of ruining them, essentially, about 86% of our peat bogs are now degraded or damaged, and all of those are emitting carbon dioxide. And it's got to such a point now that these amazing carbon reserves, which ought to be really contributing to our effort to tackle climate change,
Hmm.
are actually turning into net emitters of carbon dioxide. So, in other words, they're contributing to
Yes.
climate change when they actually should be helping us to defend ourselves against it.
Goodness me, it's I know there's going to be several listeners, and I know exactly who they will be. That will be astonished by what you've just said. And
Mm.
and where is this peat, for instance, coming from? Where is there a particular location that is producing the most of this, or is this a fairly widespread? I mean, it's spattered across the country.
Well, peatlands tend to be in the sort of northern hemisphere, in sort of the boggy bits, as it were. So it's right the way across the UK, but the two main places where peat extraction happens at the moment are Scotland, and particularly the kind of borders and the lowlands there, and also Northern Ireland. There is no peat extraction in Wales. There is just one area of England which still extracts peat, and that's in the Somerset Levels, actually just around the corner from where I live here.
Okay.
So
Which again, we've all heard about on the news over the last 10, 15 years, with catastrophic amounts of flooding and
Yep.
flash flooding and terrible things. I mean, people have been flooded half a dozen times in 5 years. And I'm assuming that, I'm not saying it's directly as a result, but if we're taking away the environment's ability to hold water, and certainly a location like the Somerset Levels, we are contributing to that directly, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly right. And there are places which are actually worked out peatlands. So, in other words, peatlands where the peat, a lot of the peat, not all of it usually, but a lot of the peat has already been dug out for horticulture,
Hmm.
and they have been handed over to organisations like the RSPB, wildlife trusts, and so on to manage as nature reserves. And they've actually reflooded them, they've re-wetted them, so they are starting to sort of do their job again. But the actual peat that is holding on to all the carbon, as I say, it forms so slowly that even though those wetlands have now been taken over again, then they are it's going to be thousands of years before they actually start to do their job and help to actually absorb and hold on to carbon. We have the situation on the Somerset Levels now where you've got these amazing re-wetted peatlands where they're actually trying to sort of start the process of reversing the damage, and then right next door they're digging up mountains of peat, which you can see. They're by the side of the road, and they can be 3-4 meters high. These piles of peat that they're going to just chuck into bags and sell to gardeners. And it's when you actually see it for yourself, I can't tell you how shocking it is. And I think if most gardeners, this is the trouble with peat bogs, whether they're in Northern Ireland or Scotland, or 60% of our peat comes from mainland Europe. So we're talking about bogs which are a long way away in sort of Finland and the Baltic states and places like that. And that adds even more to the carbon footprint, because of course they have to be trucked 1,600 miles right the way
Yes.
across
Yeah.
the top of Europe in
Yeah.
order to get them to the UK for gardeners here to use. And all of this is contributing to this destruction of something which really we should we should be cherishing, we should be really looking after. I mean, I think if gardeners could actually go, peat bogs tend to be very, very remote places, and
Yes.
I've been to an extracted peat bog up in Scotland actually, and they're behind big fencing and CCTV and keep out signs, and it's very, very difficult to go and see peat being harvested. Somerset Levels, it's a little bit easier because it's more by the roadside, and I think if gardeners could go and see the damage that is being done in their name, I think everybody would be stopping using peat right now.
I, I,
It's horrifying.
I think you're right, because gardeners or horticulturalists as a general rule, whether you're a hobby gardener or whether you're a professional, we're all very, very similar as an ilk of people, as a group of people, as a community of people, that we do care, and
Yeah,
yeah, we do slow things down, and I do the little things in the garden that are beneficial for the environment and my direct environment. But I suppose almost this is for the general consumer that's, for instance, buying this at the garden centre or ordering parts online, or as you mentioned earlier, again, it must make up hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of it. For instance, buying live herbs from the supermarket and having those delivered with your home shop for your food shopping. This, because of where it's coming from, seems like it's almost somebody else's problem, doesn't it? And I'm sat here in my chair pointing off into the distance because it comes from hundreds of miles away. It's not something that we're sort of seeing down the road. I mean, it's not something I've never driven past one. I've never seen any of these locations, or would I know what they were even if I drove past it? So it seems like somebody else's issue, doesn't it? It's in somebody else's
yeah,
backyard, not here on my doorstep. But I say
yes.
it's a
It's very
massive,
much
massive problem.
out of sight, out of mind. And
Yes.
but the thing is that, like you say, I speak to gardeners all the time, every day. I am a gardener myself, and I can tell you that everybody who is a gardener, they have their hands dirty every day. They are in tune with nature. They understand the importance of things like pollinating insects and
Hmm.
habitats and
Yeah.
ecosystems, and they care about it. They care about it really deeply. And as soon as you start to explain to them all of this stuff, most of the time it's just lack of awareness, and I don't blame them for that either. But why would you be aware of all of this? You're just planting in your little garden kind of thing. But as soon as you start to talk about the wider impact of harmful things like using peat, you can see people just getting horrified, and it changes people's minds. So I think the more people know about what the impact is of what they are doing, the more they change behaviours.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so, Sally, what are the alternatives? What are the alternatives we could be looking out for?
Well, in terms of alternatives to peat, there are some really wonderful brands nowadays of peat-free compost. Quite a few of them these days, actually. But we're starting to get far enough down the road of good quality peat-free compost that there are a number which have really proved their worth. There are some sort of, some new introductions into the market every year, but I would actually advocate just waiting for a while and letting things settle down and go through the testing process, you might say. I mean, most composts have been tested, of course, before they come into the market. But in terms of sort of the way that ordinary gardeners use them in ordinary gardens, these brands need to go through the just that sort of initial time before they actually get established. There are, however, now a number of brands which are really very well established. They've been through things like, the witch gardening tests that they do every year with compost. Well, they've been through those, and they've actually stopped testing peat-based compost these days. But when they did, which was only a couple of years ago, some of those brands outperformed the peat-based composts. So we are talking about, perfectly good quality alternatives to peat-based compost. There's no reason why your plants should do any worse in peat-based, any worse in peat-free than they do in peat-based. But
would you like to go as far as to mention a couple of brands? I mean, it's
well, okay, if that's all right.
Of course it is. Yeah, as I said to you at the beginning of the call, we can talk about absolutely anything at all you like.
Fantastic.
So is there a couple of brands you'd like to mention?
Well, I mean, personally, I use Melcourt Silvergrow nearly all the time, but I do like the one with the loam in it. There's one with added loam, which just basically means topsoil added to it. Yeah. And that's just got a little bit more weight and a bit more heft, and it hangs on to the nutrients a little bit better, and it's just generally a bit more satisfying to use. So so I tend to like that. But then I've been growing with peat-free for a very long time, so I'm used to the different way that you water with peat-free, and so that's how I garden. So I tend to like lighter composts. Now, for people who are transferring from peat across to peat-free, there's a lot of adjustment that needs to be made. So, for example, with peat, you find that when you water, it gets very wet very quickly, hangs onto the water for quite a long time, and stays uniformly wet for quite a while. Now, with peat-free, what tends to happen is that the water sinks to the bottom of the pot. Hopefully, you haven't overwatered it, because it's very, very easy actually to overwater peat-free and not to realise actually that it's perfectly wet underneath the surface. The surface can look really dry, and then underneath it can actually be perfectly moist. So it's always a good idea.
We're suggesting you get that index finger in there and give it a good poke.
Exactly. Or you can just lift up the pot and check whether it's heavy or light, or those sorts of things. But with the lighter peat-frees tend to do that a bit more than the heavier peat-frees. There are some heavier brands of peat-free like Rocket Grow and Dalefoot, which use much more moisture retentive ingredients, because there's a much wider range of ingredients that you can use to make peat-free compost than there used to be with peat-based.
Yeah, and of course, Dalefoot is using bracken, isn't it?
Indeed, bracken and sheep's wool, and both of those two things hold on to moisture really, really well. So I find Dalefoot a really damp compost. I actually, it's a lovely compost to use, but only if you can get the watering right. Now, I think if you're used to peat-based, you'd probably find it easier than I do, because you are used to watering with peat. And so I think that probably you'd find that an easier transition. And similarly with Rocket Grow, that uses digestate, which is the byproduct of sustainable energy production. And so that is a much heavier material. You'll feel with the bag is physically heavier. And as a result, it holds on to moisture again really, really well. So Rocket Grow is made down here in Somerset, and it's getting more widely available now. And that's another one that I've had pretty good results
I
with.
mean, I'm sighing a sigh of relief because I've produced several videos over the last week or two with Rocket Grow. I was using that in a
Uh-huh.
I'm using that in a video not too long ago. I have used Delphi. I've met the team from Delphi, and I was talking to Kenny, who is the director of horticulture up in Covent Garden, and he is using a mixture. He's making a mixture of Melcourt and Delfoot blended together.
Now
Um,
that's a good idea.
well,
Yeah.
again, he's finding because of the displays they produce up there that they're pretty much planted displays for sort of short term, maybe 3 to 6 months. That actually they kind of need to get the watering right, and they need to get
Mm.
anyway. So they're blending the two products together to give a much more balanced watering regime. And I was also talking to Charles Carr from the Hillier Garden Centre Group. His
Oh yeah.
episode is yet to go out, and they've gone. The whole nursery's gone peat free. Um,
Yes.
and that was an astonishing thing to hear that they've changed their entire growing regime and
They're
made the
not the only
move.
ones. There's some really really big wholesale nurseries now
Yeah.
which are 100% peat free.
Uh,
There's Hills over in Essex, I think they are,
hmm.
and they're a huge wholesaler and they're completely peat free. There's Greenwood Plants down Greenwood Nurseries, I think they're called, which is an amenity plant producer. They produce 6 million plants a year,
Wow.
completely peat free.
Yeah. So
So
it can be
I
done.
could carry on.
What we're saying is it can be done if the organisation is prepared to do it. And I'm lucky enough to have
Yeah.
been associated with several of those quite naturally. Because again, as a gardener, this is something that's important to me. And I thought, well, and it's always been for me. The devil is in the detail. And
Yeah.
we're talking about sustainable packaging. We're talking about biodegradable and bags made out of potato starch wherever possible, and compostable and recyclable material. So for me, it's been something that's been very, very important to me. And something I'm astonished to find out is something that I've discovered from your not specifically, but the Peat Free Partnerships TikTok account, that this is still legal, isn't it? So we've got the government currently at the moment giving out quite large subsidies to actually rewild and repurpose and regenerate areas that have had peat extracted in large amounts of subsidies and grants, but it is still legal to remove that peat in the first place.
Yes, well, I think what you're talking about there is peat restoration. Now,
Yeah.
peatland restoration tends to happen on raised peat bogs up in the highlands. So
Okay.
they are bogs which have usually been drained for other reasons, or they've dried out due to sort of drainage further down down the line, as it were. Lots of different reasons. But you're quite right in that what's happening is that the government's spending, millions of pounds, tens of millions of pounds actually, committing lots and lots of public money to restoring peat bogs in order to hold on to the moisture and lock that carbon away. That's great. And
Yeah.
obviously that's something which we, fully support. But if you're spending public money on the one hand, restoring peat bogs in order to save carbon and to get that onto your carbon accounting and all the rest of it, and then on the other hand you're allowing peat bogs to be dug up wholesale for horticulture. What a crazy situation. Absolutely crazy, because you're undermining all that public money that you're
Mm.
spending.
I mean, you're putting a plaster over it, but
Oh,
but the bath plug is still out, isn't it? At the end of the
it's
day,
that's the analogy, is you're filling up the bathtub but leaving the plug out,
yeah.
basically. And that's particularly the case in Northern Ireland, funnily enough. I've got colleagues of mine that we work with. We are a partnership. We work with lots and lots of organisations right the way across the UK, both NGOs, but also lots of horticultural organisations, from Botanic Gardens, National Trust, Garden Organic, RHS, lots of commercial growers as well, and just loads and loads of people. But in Northern Ireland, one of our partners up there that is involved with peatland restoration tells a tale of literally being on the peat bog, restoring it, so doing all the work that's required to hold that the water in there, stopping up drainage channels and things like that,
Hmm.
and literally looking across the fence at the other side and at a digger digging it up to put in bags
I'm
for
watching it.
horticulture.
I'm
Yeah,
watching it literally just drain downhill.
crazy,
Yeah.
just crazy.
That's really quite astonishing. So
Yeah.
obviously you and the Peat Free Partnership are very heavily involved in trying to change legislation, lobbying government, and raising awareness through social media channels and writing and all the other things you do. But what can uh, general public member going to the garden centre, what can they do?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because look out on your social media channels. Literally in the next few days, we are about to launch a really big campaign to ask people to sign a petition and to write to their local MP demanding legislation this coming year, so in 2026. We've just had the first announcement of a policy, a sort of a publicly open policy from the UK government that they intend to legislate to end peat sales, which is great because that's the first time they've actually said that publicly since they came into power. So that's brilliant. We want to pick that up and run with it. Yep. They have unfortunately said at the end of that, when parliamentary time allows. That's what did for the last government. Yeah. Because the last government promised to legislate, if you remember, by 2024, but they never fulfilled that promise. And they were always saying, right the way up till they left power, they were saying, when parliamentary time allows, when parliamentary time allows. And I grew to really dislike that phrase. Unfortunately, it's crept in again. Now, what we're saying now is, don't do that again. Make sure that you find parliamentary time. And the only way that we're going to be able to keep the pressure on the government to do that is to all act together and to sign the petition. We're going to deliver it in person to Downing Street. And then once we've, in the meantime, also write to your MP, make sure that they write their own letter to the minister and say, we want this done. And that is basically the main way and the most direct way that everybody listening to this can help.
Yeah, because again, I think we're all very much aware that the targets for climate change that were set, they're going to be exceeded, whether we can beat ourselves up about it or we like. It's going to happen. It is happening already. But if we don't do something about this particular problem now, and we continue to extract those hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of peat every single year, even if this goes on for another 10 years, it's already gone on for 20, 30 years longer than it should have done already, that actually, we again, much as we talked about a second ago, it is literally filling up the bath with the plug pulled out of it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We are letting it run down the drain, and time
Absolutely.
is very much running out. So
yeah.
Again, I mean,
if anybody listening also is worried that this is going to sort of mean hardship and so on for growers, that it's also very important to emphasize that even if government passes legislation in 2026, it's not like a guillotine. It doesn't say everybody's got to stop using peat right away. That's not how it works. What it actually does, passing legislation, is it puts into place a framework and a timetable to which everyone can work. And the other problem with this is that from the point of view of the horticulture industry, this has been a real source of business uncertainty. It's meant that nobody knows what to do. They don't know whether to invest in the future. They don't know whether to retrain. They don't know whether to start trials. They don't know what to do because there is no legislation saying you have to do this by this date. And so everybody's been sort of floundering around a little bit, in paralysis, just unable to know what to do for the best. Now, if you put into place a framework and a timetable under legislation which is fair and which gives everybody plenty of time to do those trials and to do the retraining, knowing that this is actually going to come down the road in 2 to 5 years' time, depending on what you grow, then what you're going to be doing is giving that certainty back to the industry and a bit of support, so that it means that they will everybody knows what they're doing. And so we've got plenty of time. It's going to mean that we have a gradual phasing out of peat. It's not a ban like that, it's not a sort of guillotine ban. It's a gradual phasing out. And so even if legislation is passed next year, it's likely that the peat won't be actually out of our system until the early 2030s, 2030, 2031. We're talking a long time hence, which is the other reason why we mustn't delay getting legislation in, because the longer we delay, the longer we push out that period by which everybody's given up peat. We want to make it a nice, gradual, phasing out of peat. We don't want to cause any harm to anybody either. It's not like, we've got plenty of sympathy for everybody who's finding this a little bit tricky. But the fact is that if you have the support in there and if you have the time there, then everybody should be able to achieve this in the smoothest and most trouble-free way possible.
And it's not until you start talking to actual growers and find out how long ahead of schedule they're actually forecasting crops. I mean, some of the stuff that we're buying, for instance, a 5 litre shrub, if you go along to your local garden centre, some of these plants are taking 4 to 5 to 6 years to actually produce. And we're talking about, as you
Yeah.
said, rightly said, changing the legislation and giving people actually a clear framework of direction of where we're travelling to. So when they're actually forecasting stock, I mean, we're now approaching 2026, so we're talking about stock for maybe 20, oh goodness me, 2030. I can't believe we're
Yes.
saying these kind of dates, but 2030, that kind of stock is now going to seed, or that's being propagated from budwood. Um, and that stock needs to be started in the correct medium, because you don't want to be changing mediums halfway through its growth cycle, because it's
Absolutely.
going to go into shock. It's not going to perform as people expect. And it gives you a really good, clear framework of where your business model is going. You can estimate your
That's
costs,
right.
your revenue, and what's involved in it. So again, it's all very, very good sense. But again, looking at it from the other side, I mean, you can see where the government might say, "Well, we haven't." I don't understand it. It's not something I agree with, but you can see why they get away with saying, "Oh, when time allows," because again, all it does is we seem to lurch from one sort of disaster to the other, and time gets taken up with different bits and pieces. And you think, well, actually, no, someone just needs to put it on the table and make it an environmental priority right now and get it done right now, and then we can forget about it. We can move on, and we just need to crack on with the next thing.
Well, I mean, this is the point. You know, all of the time, while there is no decisions being made and no legislation being passed, there's still time, energy, and money being spent on conferences and workshops and people putting research in and all this kind
Yeah.
of thing. It's a lot of money going into this as well, to say nothing of just the endless conversations that we have about it. And the fact is that I would quite like one day to stop talking about peat, to be quite honest with you. And I think that is probably reflected in most of the growers that I speak to, who are all crying out for legislation and a little bit of certainty so that they can move on into the future with some sort of a blimmin' roadmap and a blueprint to work to. It's not
Well,
much to ask.
no, it's not. I suppose, especially when we talked about at the beginning of this, that this conversation has gone on for so many years. So, but my entire we're saying my entire career. There we go. We'll write
Yeah,
it down to my entire horticultural career, all talking about the same thing. So that's how people can get involved. So obviously they can head over to TikTok and they can find the Peat Free Partnership. I'm assuming there is a website here as
there is
well,
a
Sally.
website.
Yeah.
It's peatfreepartnership.org.uk.
Okay, and obviously they can look out for that campaign coming over the next week or two, where you're going to be delivering that statement to Parliament, and obviously make sure they sign that petition. So I should make sure that I sign that and send that link to everybody that I can send, so they can. So
Wonderful.
actually, the conversation we're having is come at a really timely time, isn't it? So we can give this a good push from our own places as well.
Absolutely right. Yes, indeed.
Sally, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. I'm very, very grateful for you giving up the time. Best of luck with the legislation and how it goes. And if you need anything, I'm going to lay myself out here now. If you need anything whatsoever, you think I can be useful whatsoever, please don't hesitate to ask. This
Oh,
episode will go
fantastic.
this episode will go out in just a couple of weeks' time. But thank you for being so generous with your time and joining me on the podcast today.
That's absolutely wonderful. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much for talking to me. I'll see you soon. Take care.
Cheers, you too. Bye.
I'm flabbergasted that we're still having this conversation. And as I've already said several times, this is a debate and a conversation that has lasted my entire horticultural career, which has spanned well over 30 years. Myself and Sally and everybody involved is bored of having this conversation, especially as a consumer and a home gardener, when you are making all of the correct decisions and reaching for peat-free plants and peat-free composts where they're available. It's time for this to end, and it's time for government to make this a priority so we can all move on to the next thing that we need to fix in our ever-growing broken world. Please do make sure that you head over to the Peat Free Partnership website. Make sure that you go over to TikTok and Instagram, give their accounts a follow and sign the all-important petition. And if you can, share these to your stories, or make sure that you write to your local MP to make sure that they are aware that this is an important conversation that we don't want to be having anymore, and that the extraction of peat needs to be legislated and stopped just as soon as possible. Next week, the Gardener Ben podcast is all about roses once again, and I have the absolute pleasure in bringing you an interview that I filmed in Hitchin with Philip Harkness, who's the 5th generation of the Harkness family to be at the helm of the Harkness Rose Company. Make sure that you tune in again next week to listen to the full conversation. The Gardener Ben podcast is brought to you in association with Peterbilt's Roses, winner of 30 Chelsea Gold medals and creating timeless roses since 1968. Go online and shop at www.peterbealsroses.com and make sure that you're following along on Instagram and TikTok. Until next week, happy gardening.